"Put your hands where I can see them. You people never learn," one of the officers barked, shoving him hard against the hood of his own car at the gas station. The chill of the metal seeped through his shirt as the man exhaled slowly, steadying himself against the sting of both the shove and the words. The two officers moved with the swagger of men who believed the world bent under their badges. Their belts clinked as they circled him, loud enough for everyone nearby to notice. One adjusted his holster, the other smirked as though this was routine sport. They spoke loudly, deliberately, making sure the small crowd pumping gas and buying snacks could hear. "Suspicious character," one muttered, writing the phrase into the silence like a verdict. "Fits the description," the other added with a scoff, though no description had been given. The black man said nothing. He stood with quiet composure, his eyes fixed on the ground but his dignity unshaken. To the officers, his silence was guilt. To the onlookers, it was invisible. No one saw a man who had spent decades studying the law, who had sworn an oath to uphold it. They saw only a suspect, another body to cuff and control. The first officer jerked his arms behind him with unnecessary force, snapping the handcuffs so tight the metal dug into his wrists. "What's in your car?" the second demanded, peering inside as though a ghost of wrongdoing might materialize. When he didn't answer quickly enough, the first officer leaned in close, sneering. "Cat got your tongue? Or are you just too used to lying?" A small group had gathered by now. Some whispered uneasily, their voices low. Others pulled out their phones, thumbs hovering over record buttons. A few chuckled nervously, the kind of laughter born not of humor but of fear, wrapped in curiosity. The fluorescent lights flickered above the pumps, casting a pale glow over the scene, illuminating the cruel theater being staged. He remained calm. He did not struggle, did not shout, did not plead. His breathing was steady, measured, as if he already knew something the officers did not. His restraint only seemed to fuel their arrogance. "You think you're better than us, standing there quiet like that?" one officer taunted. "You'll learn your place." The man lifted his head for the first time, his eyes meeting the officers with a depth that silenced him for half a beat. But just as quickly the sneer returned, the performance resumed, and the cuffs clicked tighter. Onlookers shook their heads, some muttering about injustice, others whispering it was best not to get involved. Phones stayed up, recording every second. To most, it seemed like another night at another gas station, another humiliation in a world that had grown too accustomed to them. But as the squad car pulled away, the narrator's voice cut through the moment like a gavel striking. Would. They thought it was just another routine humiliation. But within 24 hours, their laughter would turn into stunned silence. He had been raised in the kind of neighborhood where opportunity seemed like a distant rumor. His single mother worked long hours at a laundromat by day and cleaned offices at night, her hands always chapped, her body always weary, but her spirit never broken. She told him often, "We don't get to choose where we start, baby, but we do get to choose how we finish." Those words, carried in the rhythm of her exhaustion, became his compass. Nights in their small apartment were quiet, but never easy. The lights flickered because the wiring was old, and the hum of sirens outside was as constant as the ticking of the clock. While his peers on the block fell into trouble or gave up, he bent over borrowed law books, studying by dim light, scribbling notes on margins of paper he'd salvaged from recycling bins. Every page turned was an act of rebellion against the limits the world tried to place on him. His grandmother, who lived 2 blocks away, had her own wisdom. She was the one who steadied his anger when he came home bruised from encounters with prejudice. She would sit him down, press her hand against his, and remind him, "Dignity doesn't shout. It waits, and then it roars." Those words became the marrow of his being. He carried them into every classroom, every test, every courtroom where he dreamed he might one day stand. He dreamed bigger than most dared. He didn't just want to escape his circumstances. He wanted to transform the very system that had so often turned against people who looked like him. He dreamed of becoming a lawyer, then a judge, a man who could sit in the seat of authority and ensure justice wasn't just a word tossed around in speeches but a truth lived in action. The road was merciless. Teachers doubted him. Counselors tried to nudge him toward more realistic careers, and every application was another battle against invisible walls of prejudice. But he persisted. He pushed through community college, won scholarships to university, and buried himself in study until the late hours. While others partied, he pored over case law, precedent, and philosophy, determined to understand not just the letter of the law, but its spirit. Years later, when he walked across the stage to receive his law degree, his mother cried so hard she could barely clap. When he passed the bar, she told him, "You've already changed the story for our family, but I think you're meant to change it for more than us." And she was right. Quietly, steadily, he built his reputation. In courtrooms, colleagues noticed not only his brilliance but his fairness. He argued cases with precision but never arrogance, and he listened more than he spoke. Judges respected him. Clients trusted him. When he was eventually appointed to the bench, some were surprised, but those who knew him weren't. They had seen his brilliance, his patience, and his unshakable dignity. And yet, to two police officers, at a gas station, none of that mattered. They lived in another world, one of unchecked authority, polished boots, and the kind of arrogance that comes from years of intimidation going unpunished. They thrived on control, on the fear they inspired in those they stopped. To them, every black man was a suspect until proven otherwise. Their badges, rather than representing protection, had become shields to justify cruelty. They didn't just enforce the law. They believed they were the law. That night at the gas station, they didn't see a judge. They didn't see a scholar or a man who had dedicated his life to fairness. They saw only what their arrogance allowed them to see, someone they believed was beneath them. They mocked, they shoved, they cuffed, confident that their power was absolute and unquestioned. But they had no idea who they had placed in the back of that patrol car. The narrator's voice lingered over the memory like a gavel striking wood. What they didn't realize was that the man they shoved into the back of the patrol car held not just dignity, but their careers in his hands. The fluorescent lights of the precinct buzzed with a dull hum as the man was guided through the heavy doors, his wrists still bound in metal cuffs that bit into his skin. The officers flanking him moved with the cocky confidence of men who believed. Their word was law, their smirks stretching wider with every step. They paraded him past desks and filing cabinets as though they were putting a trophy on display. "Another one off the streets," one officer said loudly, tossing the arrest report onto a clerk's desk with a flourish. "Guy thought he could outsmart us at the gas station. Bet he won't be trying that again." The second officer barked a laugh. He looked guilty from the second we saw him. Suspicious, shifty, exactly the type we're trained to spot. He made no effort to lower his voice, his words deliberately audible to everyone nearby. A group of younger officers leaned against desks, sipping coffee, amused spectators to the performance. One of them grinned. "You sure you didn't just cuff a professor?" The way he stood there quietly, I half expected him to pull out a chalkboard and give us a lecture. The room erupted in laughter, some voices loud, others nervously thin. Not everyone joined in. A few veterans in the corner exchanged uneasy glances. They had seen enough over the years to recognize that sometimes silence wasn't weakness. Sometimes it was something far sharper. The man sat in the holding area, hands folded neatly in his lap, shoulders straight despite the cuffs. His face was calm, unreadable, his eyes steady. He said nothing, offered no rebuttal to the mockery circling him. To the officers, his quietness was proof of guilt. To the onlookers, it was a sign of resignation. But to the man himself, it was deliberate. He wasn't defeated. He was waiting. The arrest report grew heavier with exaggerations. "Resisted," one officer muttered, scribbling it down. "Looked aggressive," added the other, pen scratching. "Threatening tone." Raised his voice. "Uncooperative." The lies flowed easily, the sort of routine fiction that had passed unquestioned countless times before. The clerk behind the desk raised her brow. She had seen this pattern play out too many times. The story shaped to fit the badge, never the truth. She glanced at the man in the holding area. He hadn't spoken more than a handful of words since entering, and none of them had been threatening. Leaning closer to a colleague, she whispered, "Careful. Sometimes the quiet ones surprise you." Her colleague smirked. "Surprise who? He'll be processed, charged, and forgotten. That's how this works." But the clerk shook her head, her eyes lingering on the man's composure. "Look at him. He's not scared. He's waiting." The man's stillness unsettled the room more than shouting ever could. Every now and then, one of the mocking officers glanced over, expecting to see a crack in the facade. Anger, fear, desperation. Instead, they found the same calm gaze, as if he knew something they didn't. One older officer, gray at the temples, walked past the holding area. He slowed, studying the man for a long moment. There was something about the way he carried himself, straight-backed, dignified, almost regal despite the cuffs. The veteran officer frowned and moved on, but unease tugged at him. He had seen men broken before. This man wasn't broken. The arresting officers carried on, oblivious. "Tomorrow, he'll be nothing but another file in the system," one said, stretching back in his chair. "Another case number on the docket. That's how it always works." Their laughter filled the precinct, echoing off walls and drowning out the quiet truth sitting only a few feet away. The man remained silent. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he knew time would say it for him. For them, this was just another routine arrest, another night of paperwork and bravado. For him, it was something else entirely, because tomorrow, the roles will shift. Tomorrow, the same men who mocked him would walk into a courtroom and find him not in cuffs, but in a robe, seated at the highest desk in the room. And when that happened, their arrogance would meet the gavel. The clerk's whisper lingered, in the air like a prophecy ignored. "Careful! Sometimes the quiet ones surprise you." The morning sun filtered through the courthouse windows, streaks of gold cutting across polished wood and marble. The two officers strolled in with the swagger of men who believed the day would belong to them. They joked in hushed tones, convinced this was just another routine hearing, a simple matter of formalizing charges and watching their suspect processed deeper into the system. They adjusted their uniforms, their boots clicking. On the floor, with sharp authority, one muttered, "This'll be quick, another case, another win." The other smirked. "He'll probably plead out. That's what they all do. Bet he's still sitting somewhere in a cell wondering what went wrong." But as they settled into the front row, the bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise." The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. The room fell into reverent silence as the judge entered. And there he was, the same man they had shoved against the hood of a car, the same man they had cuffed and mocked at the gas station, the same man they had written up as aggressive and resisting. Only now he wore the black robe of authority, his shoulders straight, his eyes calm, and his presence commanding. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Whispered voices spread like wildfire. Phones discreetly lifted, cameras rolling, eager to capture what no one could have scripted. The officers froze, their faces draining of color. The smugness bled from their expressions, replaced by disbelief, then horror. One's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. The other shifted uncomfortably, sweat beating at his temple. The judge, the man they had humiliated, took his seat at the bench, the gavel resting in his hand. He surveyed the room with a calm gaze that seemed to see straight through them. When he spoke, his voice was steady, measured, but heavy with weight. "We are here today to review charges stemming from an incident at a local gas station." The officers shifted again, their hands fidgeting. They tried to compose themselves, but the murmurs from the audience betrayed the truth. Everyone knew exactly what was happening. The judge picked up the arrest report. His eyes scanned the page slowly, deliberately. "According to this report," he said, his tone sharp but even, "the individual in question resisted arrest, used threatening language, and behaved aggressively." He looked up, his gaze locking onto the officers. "Is that correct?" One cleared his throat, fumbling. "Yes, Your Honor. That is what happened." The judge tilted his head slightly, almost pityingly. "Interesting, because I recall standing silently. I recall offering no resistance, no words of threat. In fact, the only aggression I remember came from the two of you. The audience murmured louder. Some gasped. Others leaned forward, captivated by the unfolding reckoning. The judge continued. Furthermore, multiple recordings from bystanders at the gas station clearly contradict your written statements. He gestured to the bailiff, who set a tablet on the evidence table. With a tap, the videos played. The courtroom filled with the sharp bark of an officer shouting, "Put your hands where I can see them. You people never learn," followed by the sound of a body slammed against a hood. The video showed the man's calm composure, the officer's mocking laughter, their unnecessary force. The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, phones lifted higher. The truth was no longer his word against theirs. It was undeniable, recorded, witnessed, preserved. The judge let the video run before speaking again. You swore to uphold the law. Instead, you chose to twist it. You turned the shield you were given into a weapon. Tell me, officers, what happens when the shield is broken? The silence that followed was suffocating. Neither man could meet his gaze. Their arrogance had dissolved, leaving only stammering excuses. We thought, one began, but his voice cracked. The judge cut him off, his tone firm but controlled. The law is not your personal tool for humiliation. It does not bend to your ego or your prejudice. The law, he said, leaning forward, isn't your weapon. It's everyone's shield. Applause erupted from the back of the courtroom, hesitant at first, then swelling until the whole gallery was on its feet. The officers, once confident and untouchable, now shrank in their seats, faces red, stripped of their armor of arrogance. But the reckoning was not over. The judge flipped through the report again. You wrote that I resisted arrest, yet here you are, unable to point to a single action that supports that claim. You wrote that I was threatening, yet the recordings show otherwise. Your words were the only threats uttered that night. Do you deny this? They said nothing. Their silence was as loud as any confession. He leaned back in his chair, his robe falling in folds around him. Gentlemen, the very system you sought to exploit has turned its eyes upon you. You thought you were teaching me a lesson. Instead, you have taught the world a truth it will not forget. The gavel struck once, the sound like thunder. The courtroom erupted again. Applause, cheers, the sound of justice reclaiming its place. Phones captured the moment from every angle. Videos destined to spread across the internet within minutes. The officers sat slumped, broken. Their once proud posture collapsed under the weight of exposure. Their own words, their own actions, their own arrogance had become the instruments of their humiliation. The judge's final words hung in the air like a verdict carved in stone. The law isn't your weapon. It's everyone's shield. And with that, the humiliation they had orchestrated flipped. Their laughter, their lies, their swagger, all turned back against them, immortalized on screens that would replay their downfall again and again. The gavel's echo still hung in the air as the courtroom erupted once more. Applause mingling with gasps and whispers that refused to die down. The two officers sat rigid, red-faced, stripped of the swagger they had carried into the room. They looked smaller somehow, diminished under the weight of the very system they thought they controlled. The fallout began instantly. Reporters who had been seated in the gallery scrambled to file stories, cameras flashing as the extraordinary reversal unfolded. What was supposed to be a routine hearing had transformed into a public reckoning, and everyone present knew history had been made. Fellow officers who had once laughed along at their jokes now avoided their eyes. Some even shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unwilling to defend behavior that had just been laid bare in front of a crowd, and worse, in front of a recording now preserved forever. Respect they once commanded dissolved like mist in the morning sun. Their names, once spoken with deference inside the precinct, were now whispered with contempt. By the time the court recessed, the shift in power was complete. The man they had mocked as suspicious was celebrated as a symbol of dignity and justice. The officers were no longer enforcers of the law. They were examples of its failure, exposed for all to see. Within hours, news outlets seized on the story. Headlines flashed across screens. Arrested at gas station. Judge presides over officers' hearing the next day. From suspect to symbol, a judge's extraordinary reversal of fortune. Clips spread like wildfire. The moment he walked into the courtroom in his robe, the playback of the gas station video, the stunned expressions on the officers' faces, and above all, his resonant line, "The law isn't your weapon, it's everyone's shield." Legal peers lauded him for his restraint. Activists hailed him as proof that the system could still be turned toward justice. Politicians issued statements praising his composure and calling for broader reforms. To the public, he was more than a judge. He was a reminder of the power of integrity in the face of humiliation. That evening, after the courthouse had emptied, and the whirlwind of attention had begun to settle, he found himself alone with his thoughts. He stepped into his chambers, removed his robe, and sat quietly, the weight of the day pressing down at last. For all the applause and recognition, there was one voice he longed to hear. He picked up the phone and dialed his mother. She answered. On the second ring, her voice tired but warm. "Hello? Mom," he said softly, his throat tightening. "It's me. I don't even know where to start. Today." He paused, fighting back emotion. "They mocked me. They shoved me. They cuffed me like I was nothing. But this morning, Mom, I sat on the bench and presided over their hearing." There was silence on the line, then the sound of her breath catching. "You did?" she whispered. "Yes," he said, his voice trembling. The whole courtroom saw it. The videos, their lies, everything. And when it was done, the people stood. They applauded. Tears filled his eyes as he listened to her response. Her voice was thick with emotion, but steady with pride. "You didn't just sit on the bench today, baby. You made justice stand tall." He closed his eyes, pressing the phone to his ear, letting her words sink deep into the place where all his years of struggle and sacrifice had lived. Meanwhile, outside that quiet moment, the story had already taken on a life of its own. Videos of the arrest and the courtroom spread across social media with ferocity. Millions watched the officers' sneers at the gas station dissolve into stammering silence in court. Memes appeared within hours, juxtaposing their arrogance with his dignity. The officers' names became shorthand for abuse of power exposed. No longer respected in their precinct, they became infamous far beyond it. Parents told their children, "The story as a lesson. Arrogance will always fall before truth." By nightfall, the entire nation, and much of the world, had heard what happened. What began as an act of humiliation at a gas station had turned into a symbol of reversal, of dignity rising where arrogance had tried to crush it, and at the center of it all stood a man who had lived his grandmother's words. Dignity doesn't shout. It waits, and then it roars. The story did not end in the courtroom. If anything, that moment was only the beginning. For the man in the robe, the extraordinary reversal became a platform to push for something greater than vindication. In the weeks that followed, he began meeting with community leaders, lawmakers, and activists to advocate for reforms in policing. He argued that accountability should not be treated as punishment, but as protection, for citizens and for honest officers alike. His words carried weight not only because of his title, but because of the story that had electrified the nation. A man arrested one night, presiding as judge the next. He launched mentorship programs for young black law students, determined to break down the walls he had once fought against alone. "There are more of you than they want you to believe," he told them in packed lecture halls and workshops, "and the system changes only when you step inside it." He also established initiatives to protect marginalized communities, ensuring no one else would endure the humiliation he had faced at that gas station. Meanwhile, the two officers' worlds unraveled. The department suspended them within days, pending investigation. As evidence mounted, the videos, the falsified reports, the testimony of witnesses, dismissal was inevitable. Their reputations, once shielded by their badges, dissolved. In disgrace. They had become infamous not for their service, but for their arrogance, etched into the public memory as symbols of power undone by truth. The police department, under pressure from national attention, introduced stricter training, programs focused on bias awareness and lawful restraint. Oversight committees gained sharper teeth, with new procedures for reviewing misconduct. At the very gas station where the incident began, the owners partnered with community groups to provide meals, support, and education for vulnerable youth, a small but symbolic act of restitution. And then there was the internet. The courtroom clip went viral in hours, then global in days. Hashtags surged. Equal justice served, equal dignity on the bench, equal law over badge. Millions of people across continents shared the moment he walked into the courtroom in his robe, transforming humiliation into triumph. The video of the officers sneering. Words at the gas station played side by side with their pale, stunned faces in court. Comment threads flooded with praise, outrage, and hope. For many, the story was more than just entertainment or spectacle. It was a parable. Teachers showed it to students as a lesson in dignity and perseverance. Churches wove it into sermons about justice. Activists cited it as proof that arrogance and abuse of power could be brought to heel. The man himself remained, grounded, never once using the story as self-congratulation. When reporters pressed him, he said simply, "This isn't about me. It's about the law. It belongs to the people, and it must protect the people." He had lived his grandmother's words to the fullest. Dignity doesn't shout. It waits. And then it roars. And his roar had echoed far beyond the walls of one courtroom, reverberating through a nation hungry for examples of integrity, overcoming arrogance. They mocked him at a gas station, forgetting the law doesn't bow to arrogance. They shoved him, cuffed him, and laughed as though he were nothing more than a prop in their nightly theater of control. But within 24 hours, their arrogance collapsed in front of the very system they thought they owned. And his dignity, the same quiet dignity they mistook for weakness, rose to the highest seat in the room. What unfolded was more than a personal victory. It was proof that the shields of arrogance eventually crack, while truth remains unbreakable. He did not need to shout to be heard. His silence carried more weight than their mockery. He did not need to fight to prove strength. His knowledge dismantled every lie they wrote, and he did not need revenge because justice itself stood at his side. This is the lesson the world saw. True power, dekik knowledge. True wealth, humility. True downfall, arrogance unmasked. The story is not about handcuffs or robes, but about the enduring truth that dignity cannot be erased. It only waits for its moment to roar. If you believe justice has no color, no rank, and no exceptions, share this story. Let the world see. Dignity always finds its day in court.